Hello again. So this is our last video. What we're going to be covering off today are pivot tables and pivot charts. There are a couple of comments that have to be made today in around setup. The textbook uses a tool called Power Pivot and Power View, which we are not going to use. I found that they were problematic to get them installed on Fanshawe computers, as well as on home students or online students would find it could be problematic to install it on your home computers, and it really doesn't add enough to force us to go through that sort of pain. So you're going to find that discussion around pivot tables or Power Pivot and Power View have been sidelined for this video and for this lesson. In addition, the textbook has you downloading an Access database file to start, and again, as we've said before, since Access is not available to a Mac, we have sidelined that as well. So when you download your start file, the EXL09 census start file, it'll be pre-populated with the data that you need, so that you don't have to worry about bringing that in. All right, so basically the steps are simply we're just going to go through pivot tables. So and there's a couple of things, skill 9 and skill 10, we're not going to cover it all. Okay, so let's get started. I want you to click on sheet 1. First thing we're going to do is change the sheet name. So from sheet 1 we'll call it demographics. Okay, so let me just review what this sheet contains. It contains some fictitious census data. You would see if you go through it in detail that there are two zip codes identified, 93464 and 93465. There's an ID number at the start, which is simply a sequential number, goes from 1 to 1,000. There's 1,000 rows of data. Housing tenure determines, so basically what a census does is they go and ask homeowners certain questions that they can then use in statistical analysis for the city, for the country, etc., to make decisions around stuff. All right, so just so you're aware of how the zip codes work in the States or postal codes work in Canada, a zip code in the States, I'll use the postal code here. A postal code in Canada, the first 3 characters of your postal code is a geographical location. So whatever postal code you're in is, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 blocks in size. And there will be a number of different postal codes with the same 3 characters as yours, and those geographically are spaced around the same location in the city. So using a postal code, somebody who's looking at data can narrow in on a particular location or particular quadrant of the city or what have you. And the same with zip codes in the United States. The second column, or the third column, shows you housing tenure. So they would have asked the person who's at the door, do you own this house or do you rent it? The next column is household size, so how many people are living in the house. The next column is household income, so what's the total income of all of the people living in the house. Then gender, so the gender is the gender of the principal homeowner or the principal in the home, so the head of household. So is it female or male? Age is the age of the head of household. Race, of course, is your race. Commute is how are you getting to and from work. Okay, so somebody looking at this data would be able to determine within a certain postal code how many people are riding the bus, how many people are walking, how many people are taking a bicycle, and they could use those for decisions like do we need bike paths, do we need bus routes, what sort of parking do we need. Based on age, they could take a look and say, is this a young demographic in this location or is it an older demographic? That would determine things like senior housing or daycare spaces, schools, elementary schools versus high schools, and so on. So census is one of the key fundamental design tools that is used by governments, municipalities, and anybody else. Quite honestly, you personally can go in and pull census data, and you could do whatever you wanted to do with that, depending on what your purpose is. Okay, so that's just to give you a brief understanding of the data. So the first thing we're going to do after we've renamed the tab is we're going to create a pivot table. So before I get started, let me explain what pivot tables are. Pivot tables are basically just subtotals. So if I wanted to know within a particular zip code how many were owners and how many were renters, I would simply, if I was doing it manually, I would simply go down and I would take a look, and since this is a table, I could filter it on the postal code, and then I could total at the bottom. Well, let me do that. I'm going to add a total row here. So again, we're in a table, so I'm going to go to Table Tools and Total Row. So on the total row, I have the ability to put things in. So right now you can see at the far right it says 1000. When you create a total row in a table, automatically it will total the last column if it's numbers, and it will count the last column if it's text. So in this case, it's counted it to say that we have 1,000 rows. Then I could put something in like, all right, what's my average age? What's my average household income? Because total household income is pretty much meaningless, but average household income would be a number that I can use. And I'm going to change the format on that so that it's something that I can understand a little bit better. And I'll get rid of the decimal points because I don't really want them. What's the average household size? What's the average number of people that are living in this particular house? And again, I'm going to go and change that to a number. And so on. And then I could do things like I could filter, so I could say in this particular zip code, so we'll go with 93464. Then I can look at my total row and I can see that my average household size in that location is 4.6 people per household. My average household income is $127,000. My average age is 46, and I have 533 households in that particular zip code. So using a table, I can do a lot of the calculations that I need to do with pivot tables. It just means that you have to do them all individually, and it's not nearly as graphical as a pivot table, and you'll see that as we get into it. If I wanted to know how many are owners, I could simply click on owners, and I would see that in that particular zip code, 464, my average household size for people that own their house is 4.5. My average income is 120. My age is 46, and there are 344 people in that area that in zip code that are owners of their homes. All right, so I'm going to go in the Data tab. I'm going to click Clear, which will clear all the filters and give me back my 1,000 rows of data. Okay, so let's go about and create a pivot table. It's pretty straightforward. Just click on any cell within the table. Click on the Insert tab. Click on Pivot Table. By default, it will automatically select the whole table. Notice that this table has currently got a name of table_EXL09 census data.accdb, which is the Access database name that it was originally brought in from. I want to create my pivot table on a brand new worksheet, so I'm going to click OK, and you can see it creates a new sheet called Sheet 1. I'm going to drag that to the right of demographics so that I continue to have my logical progression as I work across. Okay, so once you create a pivot table, you'll see what you end up with is this graphic on your screen that says Pivot Table 3. That's the name of the pivot table. We're going to change that, so I'm simply going to go up on the Pivot Table Tools tab in the Analyze menu, and I'm going to click on the pivot table name, and I will call this Census. Well, I think in the textbook they call it Demographics, so we'll do the same thing. All right. Find that a little bit confusing because the first tab is called Demographics as well. But anyway, so my pivot table is now called Demographics. I'm going to change my sheet name to Housing Tenure. Okay, so what we do for a pivot table is you can see on the left you've got the graphic, which is basically just a graphic. It's just a placeholder for where your pivot table is going to go. The important part is on the left-hand side of the screen you see something called Pivot Table Fields. And within there you have a list of all of the different fields. So ID to commute, and if I go back to demographics, you can see my headings are ID to commute. So I have each field that's on my original data, and then I have 4 boxes below. I have one called Filters, Columns, Rows, and Values. So basically what happens with a pivot table is we move or we drag column headings from the pivot table fields at the top into the boxes below. Filter would allow us to do, show me only a particular location. Column and row headings are basically, well, let me go back. So the values field is where you put numeric numbers that you want to either total or average or count or something along that line. Rows and columns are where they intersect. So let's just go through and do it. So what I want you to do is I want you to take zip code, and if I simply click the checkbox, it'll move zip code down to the rows. And you can see over in my spreadsheet now in columns in A3, 4, 5, and 6, I have a heading called row labels, and then I have the 2 zip codes that are available in my source data, and then I have a value called grand totals. And I'm going to bring over housing tenure. So I can simply put a checkbox there and it will put it below those. Or you have the option here to just simply click and drag. So I can drag it here. So now you can see that I have postal code or zip code 464, and underneath that I have owner and renter. And then I have zip code 465, and then I have owner and renter. So in effect, what is going to happen is that it's basically sorting my data and producing subtotals. So in this case, I'll have a subtotal of owners within that location, within that zip code, and renters within that location, and the same for the other zip code. So far all I have are headings. Now what I need to know is, what do I want to subtotal? So I have to subtotal one of my numeric fields. So in our case, we're going to use the ID. So I'm going to click on ID, and it's going to drag it down into the values. Anytime you have a numeric field, by default, pivot tables will move it into the values field. Now in this particular case, what it has done, and the default is simply sum, it has added up all of the IDs. If I go back to my original data, you can see that the ID number is simply a sequential number that identifies a particular row. So by itself, the ID number is meaningless. It's just the luck of the draw as to which ID number that you got. However, it does give us the ability to say, if I go in here, so I'm going to click on sum of ID, and on the pop-up menu, I'm going to select value field settings. And value field settings allows me to determine, well, what do I want to do with that particular number? So right now it's showing as a sum. But I really don't want a sum. That's meaningless. Average is meaningless, but count would be good because it's going to count the number of households within that area. So I'm going to click on count, and then I'm going to go down to number format, and I'm going to change it to a number with no decimals. And I'm going to click OK, and I'll click OK. And voila, now I have actionable data. In postal code or zip code 464, I can see that I have 533 households, of which 344 are owners and 189 are renters. And in 465, I have 467 households, of which 288 are owners and 179 are renters. And the total adds up to the 1,000 rows of data that I originally had. Okay, so what we've done is we've taken advantage of the ID field, not because it's a number, but just to simply say count the number of people that there are in there. Okay, so that was skill number 2. We're moving on to skill number 3. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to delete these 2 blank rows at the top of the screen, this one and this one. There's 2 ways to do that. I can highlight both cells here, go to the delete option up on the home tab, and say delete sheet rows. A shortcut is that I can highlight the rows by highlighting the row headings, right click and click delete, and that will delete the 2 rows as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is, so basically the difference between rows and columns simply determine where things sit. So right now you can see that I have zip code 464, and below it I have owners and renters. And then there's my numbers, 344 and 189. If I take my housing tenure, and I'm going to move it over here to the columns group box, I can do that by clicking the arrow and say move to columns, or I can simply click and drag and drop it in columns. Now nothing has really changed. It's just that where I used to have the zip code and then below it I had the owners and renters, now I have the zip code and beside it I have the owners and renters. I have exactly the same information. There's my grand totals and so on. I have a new grand total now that says total owners and total renters. That wasn't there before, but that's basically what happens. And in essence, that is the sum total of pivot tables. It's simply you move things around in the boxes to get the values that you want. And we're going to just kind of do a little bit of that as we work our way through here. Okay. So now what I want to do is I'm going to add gender to the pivot table. So I'm going to just simply click on gender, which will add it to the rows. So now what I can see is within zip code 464, owners and renters, I have 178 female owners and 106 female renters. So remember that sex was the sex of the head of household. I have 166 male owners and 83 male renters, and my totals remain the same. Okay. Now I'm going to take gender and drag it over to the columns. So again, I have the same thing. There's owners, and there's my female owners and my male owners. And it looks a little bit odd because basically it's just because of the width of that particular column. Column B is wider because of the column labels at the top in B1. And the heading is left justified, but numbers being what they are right justified. So I could center this if I wanted to make it look a little bit better, and so on. Okay. Or I could change column widths and so on. And you would pretty it up when the time comes. Quite honestly, I think it looks better this way, but it's completely up to you. Okay. I'm going to put commute into rows under the zip code. So I'm going to go up to my data and I'm going to put commute here. And now what you can see is within zip code 464, I can see that of the head of household, 6 females ride their bike to work and 3 males. 32 females ride their bike to work or take the bus, 108 take the car, 32 walk, and these are my subtotals for 465. Okay. Same sort of thing. I could take commute, drag it over here. That's a lot harder to read. And you can also do things like I can say drag commute above gender. Now I've got male and female bike, male and female bus, and so on, which is really, really quite hard to read. So I'm going to drag commute back over here. Okay. So I can take gender, move it over here. So now there's females, buck, bison, ride, and so on. And I could take commute and drag it over to my rows. Okay, so, and again, the beauty of pivot tables is that every intersection of a column and a row heading, it's going to total or subtotal whatever value you have in the values box. In this case, we're using the count. So this is telling me the number of people that bike in the bus and so on. You can simply drag them around back and forth. You can change the order. If I took gender and put it above zip code, then I would have females in those 2 zip codes, then males in those 2 zip codes. I'll put it back to where it was. I could drag house commute above housing tenure. So now that I have owner, bikes, and renters and so on within each one, it's very visual in the way that it works, and it's simply a matter of dragging things between the different boxes. If I wanted to take housing tenure out, I can either click the arrow and say remove the field. However, the simplest way is simply to click on the field and drag it out of the box. So now I've got just basically bus, bike, so bike, bus, car, walk by female and male. All right, so I'm going to put housing tenure back in, and I'm going to add housing income. Now, because household income is a numeric number, it moves into the values section. And again, this is sum of household income is pretty much meaningless, because if you've got 8 people living in the house, you might have $500,000 of household income, and then you have somebody else who's a single in their house, and you might have 60,000 there. So adding up the household income is really not valid. But an average household income is something that would be worthwhile. So we're going to change sum of household to average. So I'm going to click on value field settings. I'm going to change it to average. I'm going to change the format to accounting with no decimals. And I can also change the name. So what it automatically does is it simply sticks average of or sum of or whatever in front of the column heading. So I'm just going to change this to average income. And I'll click OK. All right, so now you can see that within zip code 464, my average income is $66,992, and then broken down by female owners, renters, male owner, renters, and so on. I'm going to take out commute. Okay. So now you can see that my grand total, my average income is $121,532. To double check, I'm going to go back to demographics. I'm going to go down to the bottom, and I can see there's my average household income, $121,532. So we're in sync. So that's a good thing. So that was skill number 3. Skill number 4, we're going to move around things a little bit again. And I'm just going to show you. Okay, so what we're going to do is go back to housing tenure, and we're going to select, I don't want to do that. So we're going to remove the count of ID. So we're going to get rid of the counter. So they only have the incomes, not the number of people with that in there. And I'm just going to show you again. When you're in the pivot tables, you get the new table or tab called Pivot Table Tools, of which there's an Analyze tab and a Design tab. Analyze tab is how you add and subtract things from the pivot table. Design is how you change the look and feel. So I'm going to go over here to subtotals. So subtotals in this case do not show subtotals, so it would take out my subtotals. Or I can say show my subtotals, and I'm going to put them at the bottom of the group instead of at the top of the group, so that I get females, owner, renters, subtotal, male, owner, renters, subtotal, and then zip code subtotal. Grand totals, well, I could say I don't want the grand totals, so I could say off, and I don't have grand totals at all. Or I can say on for rows and columns, it puts my grand total back on the bottom. And if I had something in my column field, it would put grand totals to the right as well. Report layout is just how it's going to look. So there's different, that's compact, there's outline form, there's tabular form. We're just going to go back to compact, and I'm going to go back and put my space in, put the totals at the bottom. And then finally I can have this one that says show a blank line after each item, which will actually force it to a blank line. There's also an option there to show remove, so add and remove. Okay. I also have the option here, I can turn on banded columns or banded rows. Alright, so we'll just turn on banded columns. Okay. Okay, I'm missing something here, but that's okay. It'll work out. Okay, so skill number 4, we're going to say change calculation type. So I'm going to move housing tenure over to my columns. So now I have owners and renters, numbers. Okay. I'm going to add household size. And again, remember the household size is the number of people in the household. So sum is meaningless. I'm going to change that again to an average. By the way, there's a second way to do that. If I click on sum of household size and I go to my Analyze tab, there's an option here on the tab menu called Active Field. So I can click here to bring up that same dialog box. I'll change it to an average, and I'm going to change it to a number with 2 decimals. And I'm going to change my custom name. Just want to make it a little bit smaller. Maybe I'll just go with AVG. Average household size. Okay. All right, so now I can see that female, male, and so on and so forth for this household size. All right, now what the textbook has us doing here is after you've completed all your analysis around one aspect of the data, I'm going to copy that workbook over to the end of my worksheet so that I still have my original workbook, my worksheet, the housing tenure one that I could do all my calculations on, has all of the data in it, and I've already done a lot of work on to get to this one for average income, so I'm going to simply copy this workbook to the end. Now there's two ways to copy a workbook. I can right click, or worksheet, I can right click and say move or copy, create a copy, and where do I want it to be? A second way to do it is if I hold my control key, click on a tab and drag, it will create a copy. Okay, and I'll call this one average income. Okay. So skill number 5 is all about calculated fields, and the textbook uses Power Pivot, which of course we're not using, so I'm going to show you two ways to create a calculated field. One way to create a calculated field, and I'm going to go back to the demographics just to show you here. What we have in here is, again, here's your household size and there's your household income. So in the first row I have 3 people in that household, and the total of all 3 of them is $176,000. Now I have no idea what that is made up of. I could have one person in the household that makes $176,000 and 2 others that aren't working. I could have 2 people in the household that between them are making $176,000 and the third person is making nothing, or I could have 3 people in the household between them they're making $176,000. I really don't know. So the household income is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, it's good enough for some of the decisions you're going to make, but we're going to add a new field called per capita income, and per capita is simply the household income divided by the number of people in the house. Okay, so what I'll do is go to cell J1 and I'm going to type per capita income, and that will add a new field called per capita income to my table. Now again, when you add a new column or a new row to a table, it will automatically expand the table to include that new column or that new row. If you don't want to do that, when you created it, there's an option there to say do not expand the table, but in our case this is fine. This is what we want to do. All right, so before we go into anything else, I want to talk to you again about tables. So tables are a unique construct within Excel. You create a table by clicking on it and saying format as table, or going insert table and then giving it a format. So as you can see here, I know that this is a table because I've got filters on my headings and I have a table tools menu. Right? Now I can change that from being a table to not being a table by clicking on convert to range, but in this case I want it to stay as a table because a table gives me the ability to add a total row, and the total row I can say average, max, min, sum, count, and so on. The beautiful thing about a table is, about a total row, is that when I filter the table to say only show me owners, then my total row will only total or average whatever is showing on the screen. All right, let me show you. So if I'm going to click here, I'm going to say only show me owners. So if I take a look at my row numbers down the side, you see I go 1, 2, 3, and then I jump to 5. And then I go 6, and then I jump to 8, and then I jump to 11, then I jump to 14, and so on. Okay, and that's because what a table does when you filter is it simply hides the rows that don't match the filter. But if I go down to the bottom, you can see that my household income, and well, let me look over here. So where's my count? Let me put my count back in here. So out of my 1,000 rows, 632 of them are owners. And this number only pertains to owners. That's why it says subtotal. Okay, so that is the average, that is an average, that is an average, that is a count. And so, sorry, there's my 632 there, and I've added it in here as well. If I clear that filter, then you can see that my number goes back to 1,000 and my numbers change because these are now factoring in owners and renters. Okay, so that's the beautiful thing about the total row in a table. It only identifies the rows that are visible. Okay, so what I want to do, the other value of using a table is that you can your formulas, you can create what is called a calculated column. Okay, so what a calculated column means is that when I create my formula, instead of using cell addresses, it will use the name of the row. Now you can still use cell addresses, and I'm actually going to show you 5 different ways that I can calculate this per capita income. Unfortunately, only 2 of those ways will work with my IT lab. So we have to be careful that we do the correct way, and there's, as I say, I'm going to show you the 3 that I don't want you to use first, and then I'll show you the 2 that you should use. So one way to create a formula is I can say equals, and I could say household income is E2 divided by household size D2. And when I hit enter, I get my formula. And again, when you have a table, you create a formula, it automatically carries that table through, or that formula through the whole table, so you don't have to use the fill handle. The problem with that is that that's not a calculated column, and my IT lab will mark it wrong. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. A second way to do it is I could say equals, and I could point to the column. So you can see up here I'm pointing to the letter E. I want household income divided by household size. So we can see my formula says equals E colon E divided by D colon D. And I can hit enter, and again it will work, but my IT lab will mark it incorrect. So we don't want to do it that way either. A third way, which is better, is I could say equals, point to my column, so point to my cell, household income divided by household size. Now I'm starting to get calculated columns, because you can see in my formula that it says equals square bracket @ square bracket household income, 2 closing square brackets divided by, and so on. So even though that's close, the problem is my IT lab won't recognize those @ signs and it'll mark it wrong. Okay, so I'm not going to use that one either. So we get to the 2 ways that you can do this. You can so equal, and instead of pointing to the letter E, you can see that little black arrow that shows there. I'm going to move down and just point so I get a black arrow above the column household income. And I'm going to click. So now I get equals square bracket household income divided by household size. I get square bracket household size. That way will work. My IT lab will mark that correct. Okay, so the problem is simply if you use the point to the cells, you've got those @ signs. If you do it that way, you've got to delete the @ sign and one set of square brackets, which is kind of a pain in the butt to do. Okay, so that's one way I can do it. And the other way that I can do it is I can simply type it in. So I can say equals, and I type a square bracket, and it'll give me a list of all of my headings. So I'm going to say I want household income, double click. I have to close it with the square bracket, and then I can say divided by, and then square bracket again, household size, double click, close it with the square bracket, and hit enter. All right, and that way will work. And that's probably the easiest way to do this. So again, when you're working with calculated columns in a table for my IT lab for marking, if you're working on your own at home, I don't care how you do it, because it's not going to matter. It's going to give you exactly the same result. But it's just a quirk within my IT lab that for here you have to use calculated columns without the @ sign. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to select all that data. So Shift Control down arrow, and I'm going to format that as let's say currency or accounting format with no decimal places. Okay, so now I have my per capita income. So what this is saying is in that first row 2, 176 divided by 3, the per capita income in that household is $58,000. Here I have $184,000, but 8 people living in the house, so my per capita income is very low, $23,000. Somewhere down here, there's one that here's one here that's $62,000. I think I've got one where I've got somebody who's making $400,000 and he's a single house. There's one for 106, and so on. It doesn't matter anyway. All right, so I'm going to go down to the bottom, and just so you know how I'm jumping around, if I hold the control key down and push the down arrow, it'll automatically move to the bottom of the table. And I'm going to put my average per capita income in here, and it says my average per capita income is $44,038. Okay. Now that's not the same as taking my average household income and dividing it by my average household size, because that's not quite right. What this is going to do is it's going to take average household, because this total here is actually an average of my household income, and this is an average of my household size. So this, my per capita income, is not that divided by that. This is each individual row of the household income divided by the household size. Anyway, just so we don't, I probably just confused the snot out of you because it confused me too. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my housing tenure, but notice that that new field that I created, per capita income, is not here. All right. The reason is that when you create a pivot table, the data is kind of static. When you create the pivot table, when you insert a pivot table, it takes the data and moves it into a pivot table. And at that point in time, the original source data and the pivot table are not linked. So if I make a change to a number in my source, it will not show up in my pivot table. Now I'm going to show you how to make it show up, but it's the same thing here. I added a new field called per capita income to my table, but it doesn't show in my list of fields. To get it to show, I'm going to have to go back to my Analyze tab, and I'm going to have to click on Refresh. And what refresh will do is if I had changed any numbers, it would change the numbers in my pivot table, and it will also add my new field called per capita income. All right? Okay. So I'm going to add that to my table. All right? And then I'm going to change it from a sum to an average. And I'm going to change the number format to accounting with no decimal places. And I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click OK. All right? And there at the end, you can see there's my $44,038, which was my total average per capita income. All right, and I can take a look at this and say, I don't particularly like the way it looks. I'm going to take gender, maybe get rid of it. I'm going to take housing tenure, move it back over here under zip code. That's much easier to read. So within that zip code for owners and renters, I can see there's my average income, my average household size, and my average per capita income. All right, I may at this point in time say I don't need average income anymore, so there's my household size and my average per capita income. Okay, so you have that ability to kind of move stuff around once you have done all of that. Okay, so normally what I would do is I would then make a copy of this worksheet. I'd call it per capita. So that I can go back to my normal data and do whatever I want with that. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to clear a bunch of this stuff out of here. Actually, just start right over again. All right, so I'm back into a brand new worksheet. So I'm going to add household size and select race. And again, household size is wrong, so I'm going to click here. I'm going to go to field settings. I'm going to change it to an average. Change the number format and click OK. Okay, so average of household size by race. And I'm going to put the zip code back in as well. Now this is not necessarily the way I want it, so I'm going to take zip code, drag it above race, so that I now have sorted by race within zip code, so you can see the numbers there. And I'll throw housing tenure into this as well. Maybe I'll put housing tenure over under my columns. So now I have owners and renters within zip code. So I could, if I wanted to, say show me just show me owners, and just show me a particular zip code. Okay, so these are filters. I know that I've filtered the data because you can see the little funnel that shows in the little drop-down box beside the filter. Okay, I can then go back to my data tab. Now, to clear the filters, I can either click on the filter itself and say clear the filter from, or I can do it all at once by going to the data tab and click clear filters. All right, either one of those will work. Okay, so we're almost down to the end here. Skill number 7 talks about slicers. Slicers are simply very visual filters. So anybody who's working with Excel can simply go up to the buttons up here and filter from here. But if you were giving this pivot table to a third party, and let's face it, pivot tables are a great tool to give to somebody else, because what you don't want to have happen is somebody comes up and says, all right, show me how many people in this location bike versus take the bus. All right, so you do that, you give it to them, and they say, okay, well, now how many take the car versus walk? And they can do all of that themselves. If you simply give them the pivot table and say, here you go, blow your brains out. You can do whatever you want. Oh. Okay, sorry, I had to answer the phone. Okay, so what we want to do here is I want to let people select data without having to actually know that much about pivot tables. To do that, we're going to use something called a slicer. So I'm going to click on Analyze, and here I've got an option called Insert Slicer. So I'm going to put a slicer on for commute and for gender. And I'm going to click OK. So what you can see is you get these little slicer boxes, and I can change the size, move them around, change the colors, and so on. Because once you're in the slicers, you can see at the very top, I now have a new menu called Slicer Tools. And in here, I can change the way they look. So I'll just hold my Shift key down and select so that they're both selected. Change the color. All right, the rest of this I'm not going to worry about too much. And then on here, I can say, all right, if I've got my owner versus renter, well, let me just show me female. Well, I can click and it'll just show female. Just show me females who ride the bike. All right, so now I've got females who ride the bike by race within zip code. I can clear my filters here. If I wanted to have, let's say, males who ride the bike and take the bus, I can say bike and bus. Okay, so basically that's what slicers are. They're pretty straightforward. Just remember that when you're working with My IT Lab, if it says to move a slicer to a specific location, make sure that you can see space around the outside of that box so that you know that you're in exactly the right location. So if it says put the top left corner in cell E2, make sure that you're actually inside E2 and not right up against a border. Okay. All right, skill number 8, we're going to create a pivot chart. So we're going to go back to the demographics. Now I could do it from here. I could just basically create a pivot table the way I want it to be. Let's just go say per capita income, and I could go to Analyze, and I could create pivot chart. And it would create a pivot chart based on that pivot table. But we're going to do it directly from the source data. So I'm going to go back to my source data. I'm going to click anywhere in that data, and I'm going to click on Insert. And over here, I have an option called Insert a Pivot Chart. So I'm going to select Insert the Pivot Chart. And it's going to say, what's the data, which is fine. I want it in a new worksheet. And when I click on that, I get a new worksheet called Sheet 4. I'm going to drag that to the end. I would probably change that to say Pivot Chart or something. And I'm going to basically do the same thing as I did before. I'm going to simply drag things to where I want them to be. So I'm going to select ID, and I'm going to change that to count. And I'm going to select zip code, and I'm going to select commute. So now if you look at my chart, you can see that I have area code, zip code 464. There's bus, bike, car, and walk. And The other zip code I have, again, bus, bike, car, and walk, and it's doing the total. I'm going to drag zip to filter. So now I have the filter up at the top, so I can say all. So this is now a cumulative. And notice I also have the other thing about a pivot chart and a pivot table is that they are linked. And I can make changes both on the chart and on the pivot table itself. So on the chart, I can click on the zip code filter, and I could pick a particular zip code and just get information for that particular zip code. Okay, so I can do it from there. I can do it under commute. I could say just show me bike and bus, and so on. I have those options, and when I make the change here, it will make the change on the core data as well. Okay. All right, I'm going to take the housing tenure and I'm going to move it over here to legend. What that will allow me to do is to look at owners versus renters. And again, I've got a filter here, so I could say just show me owners or just show me renters, and so on. And again, I've got the same options that they're linked together. And I have all my other options for tables or for charts. I can click here, I can add a chart title. Right? I can change the chart type, so I can go up to design, change chart type, so I could change it to, say, a bar chart. I can go up here, change my filter, my style, and so on. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. All right, and that, my friends, is it. And this is your last video. So next week you'll have a test.